And welcome back. As we go ahead and continue to look at conditional branching, today we're going to look at something a little different than what we've done with our if-else statements, which is that of the switch statement. Now, the switch statement you can think of as an alternative to our if-else statements that we've been using. So, if-else statements, if you recall, we've used to pretty much test to see if a condition was either true or false. There's another statement which we call a switch statement that functions very similar to our multi-way if-else statement. So like if, else if, and else. Now the switch statement uses what's known as a controlling expression to determine which branch to use. Controlling expressions are either going to be int, chars, shorts, bytes, and if you're using Java 7 or higher, you can use strings as well to determine what case to use. Now the name of the object being used as switch is placed in parentheses known as a case label. And no case label can occur more than once. There's also, of course, going to be a special case which we call our default, and that's going to always be the last section in our code. So let's look at this with an example to actually make some sense of this. So in here I have two variables. I have int vehicle class and double vehicle total. I have a switch called vehicle class. You can see that's my case label right there. And then I have case 1, case 2, case 3, and a default case. Now with each of these, they're pretty much just printing out something. So we have this printing passenger car, bus, truck, unknown vehicle class. And you'll see there's break statements in here as well. And we'll talk about that in just a second here. But the thing I want to point out here in this example is that with our if-else statements, remember those always had to be Boolean expressions. All right, so this, of course, if you look at vehicle class, is not a Boolean expression. It's instead a integer value, which means it's looking for a specific number. And so that's already one thing that we can look at with switch statements that we can tell is very different from how we might have judged with our if-else statements, which of course had to be Boolean. So a lot of times we use inequalities to do this. The way we think about this is that this is a equals equals Boolean test. So it's looking to see if a number is equal to a value, then we're going to have it do something. So how does this actually work? Well, break statements, of course, are the key thing that we notice that stood out here. And these are used to tell a program to return to the outside of the switch statement. Otherwise, it's going to just keep on checking all cases. So, for example, if I have case A, system.println, moving on to the next case, case A, system.println, exit, break, default, break. You'll notice there is no break after the first case there. The code instead is going to print both print line statements because we never broke out of that first case. There's nothing to tell it to go ahead and simply just function as is. Now, the default, as I've already mentioned, is very important. All right, this is what acts as a catch-all for any cases that are not explicitly determined by the code. This is very similar to how we expect our else statement to work in our if-else that we've done at this point. So the way to think about default, it's very much like else. The thing is that's different here is that while default is not required, just kind of like our else, we do and recommend it. Unlike with an if-else statement, it doesn't matter. With a switch statement, you almost always want to have your default there because it will also serve to catch any errors if nothing else that's going to happen with your program. Now, I do want to, of course, recommend that we advise about avoiding the misuse of break here, right? Because you remember you looked at some of those examples there, like case A had no break statement in it, right? Well, a common error with switch statements that when things start happening is the exclusion of a break statement. Now, your compiler won't give an error because, like we saw in that previous example, with the case A and the case lowercase a, it would work just fine. In fact, it's going to go from one case to the next. However, the last case, whether it be the default case or another case, technically does not require a break. All right. And this is where you might get confusing. People may not put a break statement after the end of their default because a lot of times that default is the last case. However, if we put one in there, if we say we want to add additional cases to our program later, we already have that break statement in place. Plus, again, remember, this just makes our code much more consistent and easier for us to troubleshoot various different things. So here we are over in Eclipse looking at an example of a switch statement. You see in this one, we of course are getting keyboard input to determine how many ice cream flavors are available. And in here, we of course are using a variable, again, just like we had in our previous example, except because this one is getting user driven choice, we don't have a statically assigned value. Like if I change this, let's say to 1, then it would of course fall right into this first one, which says must be vanilla. breakout, and then that would be the end of my program. However, because we're relying on user input, we of course now have some options, we have some flexibility. And the way you can think about how does it determine which case it is, it's pretty much doing an equals test. So it's going to look to see what value is passed in here, and then it's going to check to see if it's equal to one of these other values. So let's just go ahead and run our code real quick. And if we go ahead and let's say type in 3, it says now we have options. I hope my favorite is in. And if you look, case 3 doesn't technically have anything with it. So it doesn't have a break statement, but that's perfectly fine because it's going to function the same as case 4, which will function the same as case 5. All right, and which that means it's now going to fall into case 5, which of course says now we have options. The way to think about this is that when I do it like this is effectively doing a big OR statement. So we're saying 3 or 4 or 5. So these functions are all kind of working the same. However, it's not exactly the same as an OR, because if I were to add in, let's say, a print line statement here, I'm just going to have this say line 3, just so we can see this just real quick, and I'll remove it in a second here. And let's add in one for line 4. And if I run my code and I put in 4, you'll see that it does not hit line 3. So it's not quite the same as a OR compound statement. Instead, it's doing an OR from wherever it's starting here. So that's one thing to kind of keep in mind here if you start excluding your breaks out of here. So I'm just going to go take those out real quick here, though, just so we don't get confused while looking at our program. And if I go ahead and rerun this, and let's go ahead and enter in 10 now, we say, yep, we own an ice cream store. So it's falling to this case, it hits this break statement, falls out. But what's if I enter in a number that's not in the switch? So let's just say I enter in 0. So if I put in 0, that's a perfectly good valid number. It says I didn't anticipate there being 0 flavors here. So you'll notice that that is how this default works. It's acting as a catch. Or if I go ahead and let's do something even larger than 10, let's say 15. I didn't anticipate there being 15 flavors. Again, that default is acting as a catch-all. So it's, again, the same as how you might anticipate this with being a else statement. Now, again, this is just another approach to handle some conditional branching. A lot of times people still use if-else, but switches, again, are a perfectly good valid way for us to test it. One of the things you might notice that with our switch statements here, though, is that we are testing this with specific values. All right, we aren't necessarily looking at a range of values. So, for example, if I wanted to test to see if a number is greater than 10 and I want to test for, let's say, 100. Well, it'd be easy to test specifically for 100, but what if I wanted to test for any number that's greater than 10? And you can, of course, have a default that sets up to handle that. However, what's if you want to check to see if a number is greater than 10 and you want to check another condition? So again, there are ways to handle it, but there are some times when using an if-else statement might be better for you and easier to implement than with a switch statement, where switch statements work really well when you're looking at using specific values.